So this video is going to help you to apply your knowledge to an influences on Parliament or law reform question. Just before we get started, this is a real Eduqas sample assessment materials question. And we know that there are some things in A-level law that are quite triggering and can be quite upsetting, especially if this sort of applies to you. So just want to give you a trigger warning for suicide, just in case you need it. Okay, so if this video is not for you, have a look at some of the others. So if we have a look at the question first of all, because as per usual, you always start with the question. So we're going to be applying your knowledge and understanding of law reform. Advise Nicola as to the other ways apart from the Law Commission which she could try to promote reform of the law on euthanasia in England and Wales. So this is an AS sample assessment material. On the A level, you could have exactly the same question. The only difference would be the AS, you got 18 mark. At the A level, it's 15 marks. And actually, you note that this is a part B. Part A is where the Law Commission came in. So you're not being assessed on the Law Commission on this exam, just not in this particular question. And actually, having used this as a real assessment, so many students didn't read the question and didn't see the apart from bit, just wrote about the Law Commission. And you get no marks for doing that. Zip, none at all, because you haven't answered the question. It's a tough lesson, but it's one that you've got to learn. So let's have a look at the scenario then. And just before we start, this is actually based on a real case of a young man called Tom Inglis and his mother Frances. So if you want to stretch your knowledge further, have a look at that. Just a top tip, Eduqas in particular like to use real life decided cases, adjust the facts slightly, and then use them for scenarios. Don't get drawn in to the real case. So if you knew about the Inglis case, there was a temptation to write about what would have happened, but actually that's not what it's asking you to do. So be really, really careful you don't fall into that trap. So the scenario. Tom, a young man, was being taken to hospital for minor injuries he sustained whilst playing rugby. On the way, the ambulance doors flew open. He fell out. That did actually happen to Thomas Inglis. It's terrible. He suffered major head injuries and went into a deep coma. At the hospital, he underwent 2 life-saving operations to relieve pressure on his brain, but the operations left him with severe, irreversible brain damage. His mother, Nicola, is convinced that Tom will never recover and that the only way to end his suffering would be to end his life. The only way to end his suffering would be to end his life. Nicola is aware that euthanasia is against the law, but wishes to campaign for reform to the law. So actually, a lot of the facts there are leading up to that final point. Now, what this question is not asking you to do is to explain anything about murder, manslaughter, assisted suicide, nothing about that. It is purely asking you about the way that you could influence Parliament to reform the law. So let's have a look at what the examiner says. So there's a wide range of different things that you might want to include. But what I would suggest is you don't want to do any more than 5 if you write quickly, or 4 methods of law reform if you sort of average speed at writing. But what you must include is real life examples and sort of practical advice about how somebody like Nicola could actually access these. So these advised questions, you're being asked to produce practical advice based on your knowledge of the law, which is tricky. I'm not going to say it's not. So first things first, you could state that she could set up a pressure group. And you might want to explain some successful pressure groups. Now, there's all sorts of pressure groups. You've got different groups cause groups that are to do with a particular cause, and sectional groups which are to do with a particular section of society. You've also got insider and outsider pressure groups. Don't worry about getting too bogged down in those. So you've got things like the Law Society, Greenpeace, Fathers for Justice, Amnesty International. And you're going to want to, in explaining these, you're going to want to include specific examples of successes. So Greenpeace, for example, have raised the profile of green issues and led to Parliament declaring a climate emergency, which has led on to a variety of legislative changes. As sort of leading on from that, so if you're thinking practically about, well, what can our client Nicola actually do, you can have a think about the role of her MP in Parliament, and you can state that she can contact her MP, she can write, she can email, she can go and visit them at their clinic hours, and you're going to want to mention that she could encourage and persuade her MP to stand behind a private member's bill. But it's worth mentioning that private members' bills are hardly ever successful. For a start, they have to be selected, which is quite unusual. And it's very, very unusual for a private member's bill to make it all the way through, which is why it's the abortion law that we still cite, even though it was such a long time ago. And as part of this, she might encourage her MP to encourage Parliament to repeal, create, consolidate, or codify the current law. She might be able to, you might want to state that you could have a think about judicial review on the law of euthanasia and possibly the creation of an original precedent. But that would be difficult because if we think about the supremacy of Parliament, Parliament is supreme, they can do whatever they want, judges can't question them. And you might want to, if you know them, you're not expected to know them, but if you've heard of any of the notable cases such as Diane Pretty, Debbie Purdy, or Daniel James, you may want to include the precedent that's been set there. It succinctly put, all of those cases have said that assisted suicide, euthanasia, assisted dying is not legal in the UK. So moving along to other things that she might be able to do, Nicola may be able to use public opinion and the media as a vehicle in order to bring about law reform. And there have been some examples of where this has been successful. The Dangerous Dogs Act was an act of Parliament brought in to deal with dangerous dogs. However, it wasn't terribly, you would be explaining that it wasn't terribly well thought out and didn't include reference to a range of situations where dangerous dogs who were supposed to wear a muzzle all of the time in public maybe didn't need to wear a muzzle. There was a really famous example about a dog called Dempsey, who was out and about in public, started being sick, and Dempsey's owner took her muzzle off because the dog was choking, seen by a police officer. The dog is seized because it's a dangerous dog, not wearing a muzzle in public, and is going to be destroyed. However, it is a happy ending to the story because the public was so involved, the newspapers got involved, that the court set aside the decision and the law was subsequently changed. And just to make this a really feel-good story, Dempsey went on to live a long and happy life and died of natural causes at a good age. So, good news story. So other things that Nicola can do is that she can get involved in media campaigns. So newspapers, not only physical newspapers, but also online. So for example, the passing of Sarah's Law, which was the result of a News of the World campaign wanting the public to have access to the sex offenders register. And that was directly as a result of the News of the World getting involved in that. And if you think about it, the ones that we've looked at so far, So pressure groups, writing to your MP, trying to start a judicial challenge, getting members of the public involved, newspapers, those can all work together. So they can all be as a sort of package of bigger things that may be led by a pressure group. Nicola, possibly as sort of a final thing, if you wanted to include it, all of these things that we've cited above, so all of these might lead to the establishment of a royal commission around euthanasia. However, you will know that it's been an awful long time since we had a royal commission set up, so that is quite unlikely. So you're going to want to conclude by saying that Nicola has a range of ways that she can access Parliament and try and persuade them to change the law. And instead of just using one or two of these, the best possible chance that she could have would be to use them together in combination in an organised way, likely through a pressure group. However, the notable cases that we included, Diane Pretty, etc., suggest that it hasn't been successful in the past, but it may be successful in her case. So as we said at the start, you've got an awful lot of these. You've got 6 examples of influences and law reforming methods. You don't necessarily have to talk about all of them. I would say 4 or 5, but make sure you've got those examples of where they were successful. And you can also use examples where they've been less successful to demonstrate some balance.